He had exactly 4 seconds to decide. 4 seconds before the van door slammed shut. 4 seconds before a woman disappeared forever into the dark mouth of a Seattle night. 4 seconds before Caleb Ward had to choose between the quiet life he'd bled to build and the instincts that never really left him. He chose wrong. Or maybe he chose right. He still isn't sure. What happened next would pull one exhausted single father straight into the center of a conspiracy so dangerous, so deeply buried inside the halls of American power, that no one who touched it walked away unchanged. But what? If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you, you do not want to miss what's coming. If this story already has you hooked, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this reaches. Now let's go back to that freezing Seattle night, and the moment one man's whole world cracked open. The rain had been falling since 3 in the afternoon and showed no intention of stopping. It came down in the kind of steady, bone-soaking sheets that Seattle locals called real weather, and newcomers called a reason to move back to wherever they came from. The streets of the Eastlake neighborhood were black and slick under the orange smear of sodium lights, gutters running fast with brown water, storefronts shuttered behind pull-down grates. It was the kind of night that made the city feel emptied out, like everyone with any sense had gone inside hours ago. Caleb Ward was not inside. He was walking the 11 blocks home from Harmon's Auto because his truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 he'd spent the better part of a year rebuilding from a salvage yard carcass, had chosen tonight of all nights to throw a cracked serpentine belt. Caleb had fixed the belt. Then the replacement tensioner pulley had seized. Then the battery had given out trying to restart it. He'd stood in the parking lot behind the shop for 20 minutes with his hands on the hood, staring into the engine like it owed him an apology, before finally accepting that the truck was not going anywhere tonight, and neither was his dignity. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked. He was 37 years old, and he moved like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible, shoulders slightly forward, pace unhurried, eyes that scanned without appearing to scan. He wasn't tall in a way that stopped traffic. Maybe 6'1", built lean across the shoulders and thick through the forearms in the way that came from actual work rather than a gym. There was a faded scar that ran from his left ear down along the jaw, and another, smaller one above his right eyebrow, and his nose had been broken at least twice and set crooked each time. His face had the kind of stillness that made people uneasy without knowing why. He'd been out of the Navy for 4 years. He'd been a mechanic for 3.5. Those 6 months in between were something he didn't revisit. Emma was at home with Mrs. Garza from the second floor, who was 68 and watched too much cable news and kept a handgun in her cardigan pocket that she'd never once told Caleb about and that he'd clocked on day 1. Mrs. Garza was reliable. Emma was probably asleep already. She was 7, and 7-year-olds in Seattle in winter ran out of fuel around 8:30, no matter how much they argued otherwise. He pulled out his phone. 9:47. He had 4 blocks left. He was thinking about the tensioner pulley. He was mentally going through the supplier contacts he had, calculating whether the best price was Napa or going direct, wondering if he could get it delivered by Wednesday or if he'd have to borrow Hector's Civic for the week. He was not thinking about anything else because this was the discipline he had built his post-Navy life around, staying inside the small, manageable geography of his actual problems. The truck, the rent, Emma's school pickup schedule, the 4 customers whose cars were sitting in the shop waiting on parts. That was enough. That was his whole world, deliberately kept small, deliberately kept navigable. Then Emma said, "Daddy, those men are hurting that lady." He had almost walked past the alley. Emma's hand tightened in his and he stopped. She was looking to his left, into the narrow gap between a laundromat and a shuttered restaurant supply store. She was wearing her puffy yellow rain jacket with the hood up and her rain boots with the frogs on them. And she was looking into that alley with an expression that was not scared exactly, but was something that would become scared in the next few seconds if he didn't do something about it. Caleb looked. 2 men. 1 van, side door open, engine running, no plates visible from this angle. A woman, small, dark-haired, dressed in clothes that looked too professional for this neighborhood and this hour, was being pulled toward the van's open door by one of the men while the second kept watch at the alley entrance. The watching man was close enough that Caleb could see the shape of the holster under his jacket before he could see his face. The woman was not screaming. She was fighting, silently, efficiently, trying to drop her weight and get her wrist free. She knew what she was doing. It wasn't working. The whole thing took Caleb maybe 2 seconds to read. He crouched down to Emma's level. "Hey." He kept his voice completely flat and calm. "I need you to stand right here, directly behind me, against this wall. You don't move, no matter what you hear. You understand me?" Emma looked at him. Her eyes were big and wet from the rain, and she said, "Is she going to be okay?" "Stand here, baby." He put her hand against the brick wall. "Touch this and don't let go." He straightened up. The lookout heard him coming, or sensed the change in the air, some subtle shift in weight and attention that people trained for violence learn to read, and turned just as Caleb closed the last 8 feet between them. The tire iron was already in Caleb's hand. He'd taken it from his jacket pocket almost without deciding to, the way you pull a key when you're almost at the door. He'd been carrying it since he left the shop. Just something to have, an old mechanic's habit. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. The lookout's hand went for the holstered weapon. Caleb's left hand came up and pinned the drawing arm at the wrist, while the right brought the tire iron across low and fast, not at the head. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, but into the meat of the thigh, where the femoral nerve ran close enough to the surface to produce immediate, total motor failure. The man's leg buckled. Caleb caught him on the way down, controlled the fall, and the lookout hit the wet asphalt quietly, already unconscious from the pain spike before he could make a sound. 4 seconds. The second man, the one with the woman's wrist, heard the fall and spun around. He was bigger, and he was faster than he looked, and the gun was out in his hand before Caleb had fully closed the distance. Caleb went low and inside instead of trying to take the angle, getting his body past the barrel and driving his shoulder into the man's center mass, wrapping him up and slamming him backward into the side of the van with enough force to crack the mirror off. The gun skidded across the alley floor. Caleb came up, grabbed the man's collar with both hands, and ran him headfirst into the van's door frame. Once. That was enough. The man slid down into the puddle at the base of the van wheel and didn't get up. Caleb stood in the rain and breathed and looked at both of them for a moment. His pulse was elevated but not high. His hands were steady. That was the part about himself he had never entirely made peace with, the fact that his body did not panic. Not during, anyway. The shaking, when it came, always came later, privately, where no one could see it. The woman was standing against the alley wall with her back straight and her chin level. She was watching him. She was maybe 30, dark eyes that missed nothing, hair plastered to her face from the rain. There was a cut on her cheek from a ring or a nail, and her sleeve was torn at the shoulder. She didn't look frightened anymore. She looked like a person rapidly reclassifying a situation. "Are you hurt?" Caleb said. "No." A beat. "Well, somewhat. Nothing serious." Her voice was measured, controlled. The voice of someone who spent a lot of time making sure other people couldn't tell what they were feeling. He bent down and checked the first man's pulse, then the second, both present. He ejected the magazine from the fallen weapon, cleared the chamber, and set the parts in separate corners of the alley. "You should go," he said. "Right now. These two won't be out long." "I know." She wasn't moving. "You're not going to ask me who I am?" "Not my business." She looked at him for a moment, like that answer surprised her more than the fight had. "What's your name?" she asked. "Doesn't matter." "It will." She said it quietly, almost to herself, like a prediction she'd just made and was already sorry about. Caleb went back to Emma, who was standing exactly where he'd left her, both hands pressed against the brick wall, her small jaw set in an expression of determined calm that broke his heart a little because she had learned it from watching him. He crouched down and looked her over, unhurt, dry under the hood, eyes bright and slightly too alert. "Is the lady safe?" Emma asked. "Yeah." He took her hand. "Come on." They walked. Behind them, from the alley, came the faint scrape of footsteps and then silence. Caleb didn't look back. He got 3 steps before he felt the unfamiliar weight in his jacket pocket. He kept walking for half a block before he reached in and found it. Small, rectangular, rubberized casing. The shape was unmistakable even before he looked at it. A flash drive. He turned it over in his fingers. Plain, no marking, the kind of rubberized anti-shock casing that people used for things they couldn't afford to lose. He didn't remember her being close enough to put it there. That bothered him, a lot. Emma was looking up at him. "What's that, Daddy?" "Nothing." He slid it back into his pocket and kept walking. "Don't worry about it." But his jaw was tight. He had spent 6 years as a SEAL and 4 years trying not to be one anymore. And the thing about that kind of training was that you couldn't unlearn it. You could bury it. You could build a quiet mechanic's life on top of it and spend your days with your hands in engine bays and your evenings reading chapter books about talking animals to a 7-year-old girl. You could make the past small, but you couldn't make yourself stupid. And Caleb Ward knew, standing in the rain in Eastlake with a stranger's flash drive in his pocket and 2 unconscious mercenaries behind him and no idea yet whose war he'd just accidentally walked into, he knew that whatever was on that drive, the woman had put it there on purpose. She hadn't been running from those men. She'd been waiting to see what he would do. He held Emma's hand tighter and walked faster through the rain. He had 4 blocks left. For the first time in months, they felt like a very long way. The block before home, Emma looked up at him and said, "You were really fast, Daddy." He didn't say anything. "Were you scared?" she asked. He thought about lying. He almost did. "No," he said finally. "That's sort of the problem." Emma seemed to consider this seriously, the way 7-year-olds do when they decide something matters. Then she nodded and said, "Good, because I wasn't scared either." He looked down at her. "I know," he said. "I know you weren't." That scared him more than anything else had. He didn't sleep. He'd put Emma to bed around 10:30, sat on the edge of her mattress until her breathing went slow and even, then gone to the kitchen table and set the flash drive in the center of it and stared at it for a long time. He made coffee he didn't drink. He looked at his phone twice and put it back down. Outside, the rain had eased into something quieter and more persistent, the kind that didn't announce itself, just accumulated. The drive sat there under the kitchen light like a small, patient problem. He thought about throwing it away. He thought about it seriously, wrapping it in a paper towel, dropping it in the dumpster at the end of the block, going to bed, waking up, going to work. He ran that scenario forward in his mind the way he used to run tactical scenarios, tracing every branch and contingency. What was the likelihood those 2 men in the alley could connect him to the intervention? He'd moved fast. The alley had been dark. The woman was already gone. He hadn't used his name. He hadn't left anything behind except 2 unconscious professionals who had bigger problems tonight than filing a description with anyone. The scenario held up pretty well, actually. He went to bed. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the building settle and thought about the way she'd said it. It will. He was back at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. He did not plug the drive into his laptop. He knew enough about this kind of thing to know that whatever was on it, he didn't want it on any device connected to his name. He just held it, turned it over, looked at the casing, which was military-spec rubberized ABS. You could drop it off a building, run it through a washing machine. It would survive. The seal at the port end had a custom resin plug, the kind that suggested the person who'd loaded it was being careful about moisture and physical access. Somebody had put serious thought into protecting whatever was inside. He set it back down. He thought about Emma saying I wasn't scared either, and the way she'd said it with his own cadence, his own flatness, and the familiar guilt moved through him like weather. Not sharp, just constant. He thought about his wife, about Lauren, about the last year of her life, which had been a long, slow lesson in what it meant to be helpless in the face of something that didn't care how capable you were. He'd come home from 6 years of being the most dangerous person in almost any room he entered, and he'd been completely useless against a disease that ignored everything he knew how to do. After she died, he'd had 6 months where he didn't know what he was. Then he'd become a mechanic, because engines made sense, because they failed for reasons you could diagnose and fix, because they didn't have feelings. He'd built his whole post-Navy existence on that principle. Keep it to things you can fix. The flash drive, clearly, was not one of those things. He finally slept around 4. He was up at 6:15 when Emma padded out in her socks and her hair in a mess and said she was hungry and asked if they had the good cereal or the boring cereal. They had the boring cereal. She expressed her disappointment thoroughly and then ate 2 bowls of it. He dropped her at school at 7:50 and was back in his apartment by 8:20. The black SUV was parked in front of his building, not police. He knew cop vehicles on site, and this wasn't it. Too clean, too recent model, with the particular non-presence of a vehicle specifically selected to be unremarkable. There was a second one parked around the corner that whoever had chosen this position had probably hoped he wouldn't notice. He noticed. He stood on the sidewalk in the rain with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the vehicles for a moment. He was calculating. Running branches. The lobby door opened and a man came out. Big suit under a rain jacket. The way he moved communicated ex-military without him having to say a word. Not aggressive, but occupying the sidewalk in a way that suggested he had done the spatial math already. He looked at Caleb and said, "Mr. Ward, Ms. Sinclair would like a few minutes of your time." "Who's Ms. Sinclair?" The man's expression didn't change. "She thought you might ask that. She said to tell you she's the woman whose drive you still have in your jacket pocket." Caleb looked at him. "I've got a dog," Caleb said. "You don't own a dog, sir." "No," Caleb agreed, "but I could, and it would be a reason not to invite strangers up." "We're not going up," the man said. "We'd like you to come with us." "To where?" "Somewhere dry." Caleb thought about it for exactly as long as it took to conclude that the decision had already been made for him the moment he'd stopped in that alley. You could refuse to get in the car. You could make that choice. But the people in the car already knew your name, knew where you lived, knew you didn't have a dog. The time for refusing had been last night on a different street entirely. He got in the car. The woman in the back seat was not what he'd been expecting, which told him something about his own expectations that he didn't love. He'd been in the car maybe 45 seconds before he understood he had walked in with the wrong frame entirely. Victoria Sinclair sat in the back of the SUV in a charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, her dark hair pulled back and still slightly damp at the temples, with the cut on her cheek from the previous night cleaned and butterfly taped. Her wheelchair was folded and stowed behind the third-row seat. She was sitting in the vehicle's bench seat with the practiced ease of someone who'd long ago stopped giving the logistics of it any visible attention. She was looking at her phone when he got in. She finished whatever she was reading, closed the screen, and looked at him. Up close, in daylight, she was younger than he'd read her in the alley. And something else, something he couldn't quite name. There was a tension around her eyes that had nothing to do with last night, and everything to do with someone who had been operating at maximum load for a very long time. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Didn't feel optional." It wasn't. No apology in it. "I'm Victoria Sinclair." "I know who you are." He did now. He'd spent 20 minutes with his phone that morning after dropping Emma off. CEO of Sinclair Aerospace, one of the country's largest defense contractors. Forbes profiles, congressional testimony, a cover feature in a business magazine from 2 years ago. He'd also found the accident, a highway collision 4 years back that had made the news briefly and then disappeared from the coverage the way rich people's tragedies sometimes did. "What I don't know is why your people have been sitting outside my building since before I woke up." "Because I owe you an explanation." She said it like it cost her something. "And because you're in danger, and you deserve to know why." "I'm not in danger. Those 2 men last night weren't tracking me. I was a random civilian who happened to stop." "You were." She held his gaze. "You're not anymore." Something in her voice made him want to argue, and made it clear at the same time that arguing would be a waste of both their time. He said, "The drive." "Yes." "What's on it?" She looked out the rain-streaked window for a moment, not evasive, more like she was organizing something that had many moving parts. "I need you to understand some context before I answer that." "Try the short version." She looked back at him. "My COO has been using our defense contract infrastructure to run weapons, not to sell to our government clients, to private networks, international buyers, the kind that don't file paperwork." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Hale." Something shifted in her expression. Quick, controlled, but there. "You did your homework. 20 minutes on my phone, his name's on your annual report as COO. It wasn't hard." He paused. "When did you find out?" 7 weeks ago. She said it with the flatness of someone who'd been living with a number for so long it had become a scar. I suspected for longer. I started pulling threads 6 months ago, quietly, using internal channels I trusted. I was wrong to trust them. By the time I had enough evidence to be certain, Marcus knew I was looking. She glanced at the case taped to her cheek without touching it. Last night was his response. He had you grabbed. He had me grabbed, she confirmed. I was coming back from a meeting I'd kept off my calendar. My regular security detail was redirected. I found out this morning it was a coordinated false alarm or reported incident at the main facility. Whoever Marcus has inside my operation is senior enough to move my people without raising flags. Caleb absorbed that. So the drive. Everything I've compiled. Documentation, transaction records, routing numbers, correspondence. Enough to take him apart completely if it reaches the right people. She paused. The problem is that getting it to the right people requires bypassing every internal channel Marcus has access to, which at this point is most of them. My legal team has at least one person reporting to him. My head of internal security almost certainly does. I can't use company systems. I can't use my personal devices, which have been compromised. I needed to get that drive out of my hands and into someone Marcus couldn't immediately account for. A stranger in an alley. A stranger who took down 2 armed professionals in under 5 seconds using a tire iron, she said. That's a specific kind of stranger. He looked at her. She looked back. I put it in your pocket when you checked the pulse on the second man, she said. You bent down. I was 3 feet away. I'm sorry for that. I didn't have time to ask. No, he said. You wouldn't have. He reached into his jacket and put the drive on the seat between them. She looked at it, but didn't pick it up. Keep it, she said. I don't want it. I understand. Keep it anyway. She said it with a kind of measured directness that he was starting to recognize as just her natural register. Not cold exactly, but used to being the one who said the hard thing clearly while everyone else was still winding up to it. Mr. Ward, I'm going to tell you something that you're not going to want to hear. He waited. Marcus's people pulled the alley security footage within 2 hours of the incident. The camera on the laundromat. It belongs to the building, not the city, and it covers the alley entrance. You and Emma are both on it. She watched his face when she said Emma's name. They ran facial recognition. My source inside Marcus's operation, one of the few I still trust, contacted me at 6 this morning. They have your name. They have this address. She paused just long enough to let that settle. They know exactly where your daughter goes to school. The temperature in the car seemed to drop. Caleb didn't move. He was very still in the particular way he went still when something dangerous had just fully arrived. Not a freeze, but a consolidation, like everything that wasn't immediately useful stepping back and out of the way. Emma. He said her name flat and quiet. She's safe right now. My people have eyes on the school. I tasked them there at 6:15. She said it quickly. Not nervous exactly, but aware. I want to be straight with you about what that means, though. I can keep one person watched for a limited window. Marcus has resources I can't match indefinitely, especially right now when half my own organization may be compromised. Caleb pulled out his phone. Who are you calling? She asked. The school. He was already dialing. I'm pulling her out. That's the right call. I can have a car. No. He said it without looking up from the phone. My car. She stopped. He got the front office on the second ring, identified himself, told them there was a family situation, and he would be there to pick up Emma within the hour. Please keep her in the office, and do not release her to anyone else for any reason. The woman on the phone, he knew her, Ms. Tran, had spoken to her a dozen times at pickup, heard something in his voice and said yes, of course. Right away, she'd be in the office. He hung up and looked at Victoria. I'm going to pick up my daughter, he said. Then I'm going to take her somewhere safe. And then I'm going to hand you back this drive, and you're going to use it without me involved, because I am a mechanic, and whatever you need done with a flash drive full of weapons trafficking evidence is not in my skill set and has nothing to do with me or my kid. I understand that's what you want. It's not about what I want. It's what's happening. She was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone who had already run this conversation to its conclusion and knew something he didn't yet. It was not a comfortable expression to be on the receiving end of. Marcus knows who you are, she said. He knows what you did last night, and he knows that I don't make random choices. If a man with your background ended up with that drive, Marcus's operating assumption is that you're working with me, not that you were a stranger who stopped to help. She let that sit. You can pull Emma from school and take her somewhere. I respect that. I'd do the same thing. A pause. But Marcus won't stop looking, not because you matter to him strategically, you don't yet, but because he can't afford loose ends right now. And you are, currently, a loose end that disarmed two of his people and walked away with the only physical copy of evidence that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. Caleb stared at the drive on the seat. You planned this, he said. Not an accusation, more like something clicking into place. I planned for contingencies, she said. I didn't plan for you specifically. I planned for the possibility that whoever stopped in that alley would be someone worth talking to. And if no one had stopped, then I'd have handled it differently. She said it simply. But someone did stop. You did, and here we are. He was quiet for a long moment. He could hear the rain on the roof of the car. Outside, through the tinted window, he could see the corner of his block, his building, the fire escape. Emma's bedroom window on the third floor where she'd stuck a drawing of a frog to the inside of the glass 6 months ago, and the drawing was still there, faded at the edges, because he hadn't had the heart to tell her it was blocking the light. What do you need? He said finally. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still looking at the frog in the window. He heard something shift in her voice. Not relief. She was too controlled for that, but a fractional release of something she'd been holding. Right now? She said. I need you to let me help you move Emma somewhere Marcus's people can't find her in the next 6 hours. After that, I need to get that drive into a secure system that Marcus hasn't touched, upload the files, and get them to 3 federal contacts I trust. I have a facility. I have the technical infrastructure. What I don't have is a secure window to get there without Marcus knowing. She paused. And apparently, I don't have anyone willing to drive. He looked at her then. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the billionaire CEO can't get herself from point A to point B. The billionaire CEO, she said, with a dryness that surprised him, had her security apparatus systematically infiltrated by her own COO over 18 months. So yes, currently I am working with a very short list of people I'm confident aren't reporting to him, and that list is approximately 4 people long, and 2 of them are in this car. He looked at the man in the front seat, who was looking straight ahead with the particular discipline of someone paid to be furniture. How'd you get 4 people you trust? Caleb asked. I hired them myself, personally, from outside the company, and I paid them from a personal account Marcus has never had visibility into. She said it without pride, more like exhaustion. It took me 3 months to build that list. I kept second-guessing every name. She glanced out the window. Turns out institutional trust is something you don't notice until it's gone. Caleb picked up the drive and put it back in his pocket. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He was running it the same way he'd run the scenario the night before, tracing branches, looking for exits, assessing what he actually controlled versus what he was telling himself he controlled. Emma's face in the rain last night, both hands on the wall. I wasn't scared either. He'd made her that way. The stillness, the chin-up reflex, the learned instinct to manage fear quietly. He'd modeled it every day of her life, and she'd absorbed it the way kids absorbed everything, completely and without asking whether it was good for them. That was not something you could take back, but it was something you could, maybe eventually, give a different meaning to, depending on how you handled what came next. There's a hardware store on Dexter, he said. My truck's still at the shop on Eastlake. I need 45 minutes, 2 stops, and then I'll go get Emma. He looked at Victoria. After that, you can brief me on the facility, but I'm not going anywhere blind. I need the full picture, the layout, the access points, what Marcus knows about it, who else knows it exists. Victoria nodded once. Clean, no theater. One question, Caleb said. Go ahead. The person inside Marcus's operation, the one who warned you this morning. He held her gaze. How sure are you? She held his gaze back. She didn't answer immediately, which was the honest answer. 70%, she said finally. He exhaled through his nose. Okay. Okay? In my experience, he said, 70% is what most things are. You work with it. He looked out the window. Let's go get my kid. The car pulled away from the curb. Behind them, Caleb did not look back at the building, or the fire escape, or the frog in the window. Looking back was something you did when you had the option of returning. He didn't know yet whether he did. What he knew was that the quiet, deliberately small life he'd built for himself and Emma, the truck, the shop, the boring cereal and the rain boots with the frogs, the careful geography of ordinary problems, had been crossed. Not broken, not yet, but the line was behind him now. And somewhere across the city, in an office in a building with his name on the side, Marcus Hale was doing the same math Caleb was doing and reaching a conclusion about what had to happen next. The rain kept falling. Caleb Ward sat in the back of a billionaire's car with a flash drive full of evidence in his pocket and his daughter's school phone number pulled up on his screen, and for the first time in 4 years, the old instincts weren't something he was trying to keep quiet. They were the only thing in him that wasn't afraid. The hardware store on Dexter took 11 minutes. Caleb moved through it with the focused economy of someone who had a list in his head and no patience for anything not on it. He picked up 2 prepaid phones, a roll of paracord, a compact LED flashlight, a box cutter, and a tube of contact cement. The woman at the register looked at the combination and then at his face and said nothing, which was the right call. He paid cash. He'd stopped at an ATM on the way and was back in the SUV in under a quarter hour. Victoria watched him put the bag on the floor without comment. "The shop," he said to the driver. They swung by Harmon's Auto on Eastlake, where Caleb's F-150 was still in the lot where he'd left it, with the hood slightly ajar. He had the replacement tensioner pulley in his jacket pocket. He'd ordered it same-day delivery the previous night out of habit, and it had arrived at the shop before he had. It took him 19 minutes to install it in the rain in the parking lot, while Victoria's driver stood nearby with his hands clasped and his eyes on the street and the expression of a man exercising serious professional restraint. Caleb's hands were cold, and the access angle was bad, and he skinned 2 knuckles on the bracket getting the serpentine belt reseated. He wrapped his hand in a shop rag and kept going. "You could have let one of my people," Victoria started from the window she'd cracked. "I know my truck," Caleb said without looking up. She didn't push it. When the engine turned over and held, he let it run for 90 seconds, listening. Then he got in, and Victoria's driver looked at him through the open window. "You want us to follow?" the man asked. "No," Caleb said. "Give me the address of the facility and a contact number for your inside person. We'll go separately and arrive separately. If Marcus has eyes on your vehicles, I don't want Emma in the same convoy." Victoria wrote the address on a card and handed it through the window. Then she said, "Her name is Diane. She's my head of HR. She's been feeding me information for 3 weeks." A pause. "She has a daughter, too. I want you to know that." Caleb looked at her. "I know," he said, and he pulled out of the lot. Emma was waiting in the school office, sitting very straight on a vinyl chair with her backpack on her lap and the expression she wore when she was trying hard to look like everything was fine. Miss Tran was at the desk, and she looked at Caleb when he came in with the particular attention of a person who had worked with families long enough to know when something was wrong and old enough to know that asking was usually not the right move. "Ready, Bug?" Caleb said. Emma stood up. "Where are we going?" "I'll tell you in the car." She fell into step beside him without argument. That was the part that got him. Not the questions, but the absence of them. She trusted him so completely that she just stood up and walked. He didn't deserve that. No parent really did. In the truck, heading north on Eastlake, Emma said, "It's because of last night, isn't it?" He glanced at her in the passenger seat. She was looking straight ahead, backpack still on her lap. "Some of it," he said. "The woman from the alley." "Yeah." "Are we in trouble?" He thought about the versions of that answer available to him. "Some people are unhappy about what happened last night. I need to sort it out. In the meantime, you're going to stay with—" He ran a quick calculation. Not Mrs. Garza. Too close. Too obvious. His sister was in Portland, 3 hours out. Aunt Nora. Emma absorbed this. For how long? I don't know yet. Is it bad? He let about 3 seconds go by. I'm going to handle it. She looked at him. She had her mother's eyes, same particular shade of brown, same quality of looking at you like she was reading something slightly underneath whatever you were saying. Lauren had been able to do that, and it had driven him crazy, and he missed it every single day. Okay, Emma said quietly. She looked back out the windshield. Can I bring my drawing stuff? Yeah, Bug. Whatever fits in your bag. He called his sister from the burner phone while Emma was upstairs at the apartment throwing things into an overnight bag. Nora picked up on the third ring, confused by the number, and he identified himself and gave her about 30 seconds of explanation, which was more than he usually gave anyone and still wasn't the whole picture. Nora was 41 and a former Army MP, and she'd always had the quality of receiving bad news without making it worse by reacting to it visibly. How long? She said. 24 hours. Maybe 48. I'll call when I know. Are you okay? Working on it. Caleb. Her voice shifted down half a register. Are you okay? I will be. I need you to not ask me anything else right now and just, I'm on my way, she said. I'll be there in 3 hours. He exhaled. Don't speed. I'll speed a little, she said, and hung up. He arranged it so that Nora would pick Emma up from a coffee shop 6 blocks from the apartment, a public place, busy, visible, with 2 exits, rather than from the apartment itself. He didn't want anyone who might be watching the building to have a vehicle description or a direction of travel. It was probably overcautious. He didn't care. Emma came downstairs with her backpack, her drawing case, and a small stuffed dog she hadn't carried around in almost 2 years. She didn't acknowledge the stuffed dog, just tucked it under her arm and walked to the truck. Caleb didn't say anything about it. He sat with her at the coffee shop for an hour and 40 minutes until Nora's Subaru pulled up outside. In that time, Emma had a hot chocolate, drew 4 pictures in her sketchbook, a horse, something that might have been a robot, 2 overlapping circles she said was a Venn diagram but wouldn't explain of what, and asked him 3 times if he was going to eat anything and twice whether they had Wi-Fi. When Nora came through the door, Emma launched off her stool and into her aunt's arms with the specific abandon of a child who had been holding it together and was now, with a safe person present, no longer required to. Nora held her and looked at Caleb over Emma's head with an expression that was half question and half the kind of focused maternal fury that Caleb had seen her deploy on several occasions and was very glad not to be on the receiving end of. He stood up and came over and she grabbed his arm with her free hand. 24 hours, she said quietly. Yeah. And then you call me. Not a burner number I don't have, your actual voice. Nora, your actual voice, Caleb. Okay, he said. He crouched down to Emma's level. She had her face against Nora's shoulder, but she turned to look at him. I'll call tonight, he said. You promise? He hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. He knew it, and she knew it, and there was nothing to do but push through. Yeah, he said, I promise. She reached out and put her small hand flat on his chest, just for a second, the same way she'd done since she was about 4, when she'd decided this was how you checked if someone was really there. He felt it through his jacket. Then she turned back to Nora, and Caleb stood up, and he walked back out into the rain. He sat in his truck for 3 minutes without starting the engine. Then he started it, and drove to the address on Victoria's card. Sinclair Aerospace's emergency data center was not what the name conjured. It wasn't a gleaming tech facility with biometric doors and server racks lit up blue. It was a low, flat-roofed building in an industrial corridor south of Sodo, occupying the footprint of what had been a prefab manufacturing plant sometime in the 90s. The exterior was unbranded, painted a particular municipal gray that was specifically designed not to draw attention, and the parking area was surrounded by a chain-link perimeter that read as a storage yard to anyone not looking for something else. Victoria was already there, along with her driver, whose name turned out to be Cole, though he hadn't volunteered it and Caleb had gotten it by accident, and 2 other people, a woman in her 50s named Diane, who had the compressed, deliberate stillness of someone managing significant fear very carefully, and a young man named Rio, who had the specific pallor of someone who had not slept in approximately 40 hours, and who appeared to be responsible for the facility's technical infrastructure. "Rio," Caleb said. The young man looked up from a laptop. "How long to receive and process the upload once the drive is connected to a clean system?" Rio blinked. "Define clean system. One Marcus hasn't touched. This one's clean. I built the partition myself, off-network, 3 weeks ago when Ms. Sinclair first—" He glanced at Victoria. She nodded. "When she first briefed me. Upload time for the full drive contents, assuming what's on it is under 40 gigs, 12 minutes. Processing and routing to the 3 federal contacts, another 8. So 20 minutes total from the moment we connected." 20 minutes, Caleb repeated. "Best case. If there's any file corruption or—" 20 minutes, Caleb said again, this time to himself, running something. Victoria was watching him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what Marcus does when he figures out we're here." He looked at her. "Your inside source, Diane." He looked at the woman. "Did you come here directly?" Diane's jaw tightened. "I took 3 trains and a bus, and I left my phone at home." "Good." He looked at Victoria. "Your vehicles, the SUVs, where are they now?" "I sent them back to a secondary location. Cole drove separately." Caleb went to the building's one exterior window, a narrow strip of reinforced glass set high in the wall, and looked out at the street. Rain. An empty lot across the way. A semi parked 3 blocks down that had been there when he arrived. The semi had not moved. "How did Marcus find you last night, he asked, still looking at the window. "Your off-calendar meeting. He still found you." Victoria said nothing for a moment. "He had someone tracking my medical transport vehicle. I use an adapted van for longer distances. He'd put a GPS unit under the chassis. We found it this morning." "Cole." Caleb turned. "Your vehicle. When was the last time you swept it?" Cole's expression changed in a way that meant the answer was not good. "Get outside," Caleb said. "Right now. Check the undercarriage and the rear wheel wells. Don't bring it back inside the perimeter until you've physically walked the frame." Cole was already moving. He was back in 4 minutes. He came through the door and held up a small black device between 2 fingers. It was about the size of a matchbook, with a magnetic backing. The room went quiet. Caleb took it. He looked at it. Then he walked to the back of the building, found a utility door, opened it onto an alley, and threw the tracker as hard as he could toward the other end of the block. It hit the pavement and skidded out of sight. He came back inside. "How long were the vehicles parked outside my building this morning?" he asked Victoria. She understood immediately. Her face had gone carefully still, which he was starting to learn was her version of alarm. "About 40 minutes, before you came out." 40 minutes was more than enough. "They know we're here," Caleb said. "We don't know that for certain." "We know that for certain," he said, not harshly, just as a fact that they all needed to be operating from. "So we have 20 minutes to upload the files, and we need to assume we have less than that before Marcus moves on this location." He looked at Rio. "Can you start the process right now, before anything else?" Rio was already sitting down. "Get me the drive." Caleb pulled it out and handed it over. Rio plugged it into a port on the isolated partition machine and started typing. Numbers began moving across his screen. 18 minutes and change, Rio said without looking up. "Clock's running." What happened next did not happen slowly, and it did not happen cleanly, and it was nothing like what Caleb had, in the back of his mind, hoped the next 20 minutes might look like. The first explosion was not large. It was targeted. A shaped charge on the building's main electrical conduit, placed low on the exterior wall on the north side. It took out the lights, the overhead fans, and most importantly, the building's primary power supply in a flat, percussive thud that they felt more than heard, followed by immediate, absolute darkness. Then the generator, an aging unit mounted in the utility room, failed to kick over. It tried twice, mechanical grinding filling the dark, and then went silent. Emergency lighting came on from battery backup, 2 strips of red LEDs near the floor, enough to see shapes. Rio's isolated machine went dark. "No," Rio said, very quietly, in a tone that was more devastated than panicked. "No, the partition is on the building's grid. I I should have put it on a separate battery. I didn't. How much transferred before it went down? Victoria asked. I don't know. I don't know. I can't see anything. I need power. From outside, Caleb heard it. The sound of multiple vehicles arriving. Not fast, not loud. The specific controlled quiet of people who were confident they didn't need to hurry because they had already cut off every exit. And then, underneath that, from somewhere outside and above, a voice on a bullhorn that was trying to sound like law enforcement and didn't quite get there. This is a secure perimeter. Everyone inside the building, do not attempt to exit. Not federal agents. Federal agents identified themselves by agency. This was Marcus's private security presenting itself as authority, which meant they were not worried about anyone inside being in a position to argue the distinction. Cole had drawn his weapon and was at the door. Victoria had wheeled to Rio's station in the dark and was gripping the edge of the table. How long to restore power? If it's just the conduit, and if someone can get to the generator and manually restart the ignition sequence, maybe, Rio started. Where's the generator? Caleb was already moving toward the utility room door. Back left. But the ignition system, so it's not a simple restart. The charge blew the primary relay. You'd need to bypass it and manually. Is it mechanical or electronic? A beat. Mostly mechanical. It's an old unit, diesel. The relay is a physical component, not firmware. Good. Caleb pushed through the utility room door. Give me a flashlight and tell me what the relay looks like. Rio grabbed the LED flashlight from the workstation, Caleb's own, from the hardware store bag, and came after him. Outside, the bullhorn again. This is your final warning. Exit the building with your hands visible. From the front of the building, Cole said, they're staging. 6, maybe 8 men on the north approach. I can see lights on the south side, too. Victoria's voice came through the dark, level. Cole, hold the door. Do not engage unless they breach. Copy. In the utility room, Caleb crouched in front of the generator, a battered Caterpillar diesel unit that had probably been installed when the building was originally built, serviced inconsistently, and ignored for the better part of a decade. He ran the light along the casing. The explosion had taken out the external conduit connection, and the surge had blown the primary ignition relay, which was there. A ceramic case component the size of his thumb cracked cleanly through the housing. I need a bypass wire, he said. 8 gauge if you have it. Bare ends. Rio dug through a supply shelf in the dark. I have 10 gauge. That works. And whatever you have for insulation, electrical tape, anything. He heard another sound from outside. Not vehicles now. Footsteps on the roof. They're going over the top, he said. From the main room. I hear it, Cole called back. Caleb worked fast in the narrow beam of the flashlight. His hands knew this. They knew the geometry of engine bays and electrical systems the same way they'd once known the geometry of entry points and thread angles. Through repetition, until knowledge became physical, became reflex. He stripped the 10-gauge wire with his box cutter, worked the bare copper leads into the relay mounting points, taped around the connections with the grip tape from the hardware bag, which was not electrical tape but would conduct and would hold. This is going to be rough, he said. It may spike when it turns over. Rough is fine, said Rio. If it spikes, your equipment... The partition machine has a surge protector. Probably. A pause. I mean, it has one. Whether it's rated for... Okay, Caleb said. Something hit the roof. Hard. Directly above them, the sound of a body dropping from height onto sheet metal. Then another. They were coming through the roof access hatch. He heard Cole shout something from the front, and then 2 shots. Controlled, spaced, and then breaking glass. Caleb connected the bypass. The generator coughed. Ground. A sound like something very tired being asked to do something very hard. He put his hand on the manual choke and adjusted it by feel, the same way he'd learned to read a cold engine in winter. Not by gauge, but by the quality of the resistance, the particular texture of mechanical reluctance. He adjusted, opened the throttle a fraction. The generator caught. It was loud. Much louder than a facility this size should probably allow. A diesel rattle that filled the utility room and vibrated through the concrete floor and made Rio flinch backward. But the lights came on. The building came back. From the main room he heard Rio's voice. The kid had sprinted back to his station the moment the lights hit. It's running. The transfer is running. I lost maybe 40 seconds of data. Can you recover it? The drive's still connected. It's requeuing automatically. Yes. Yes, I have it. 14 minutes remaining. 14 minutes. Caleb came out of the utility room. The front door was holding. Cole had taken a position behind a steel equipment rack, and there were 2 impact marks on the reinforced door frame where rounds had come through the gap. He was bleeding from his left forearm. A graze, by the look of it, not deep but messy. And he was watching the door with the professional patience of a man who had decided the door was his entire world and everything else was noise. Above them, the roof access hatch, a square panel in the far corner ceiling, rattled. Then the latch blew off with a crack of metal and the hatch swung down and a man dropped through it before it had fully stopped moving. He landed 6 feet from Victoria's wheelchair. He was bigger than Cole, and he had a short-barrel rifle that was already tracking. Caleb was across the room in 3 steps. He got inside the rifle's reach the only way that worked against a long gun in close quarters. Completely, without hesitation, the kind of commitment that turned off the part of the brain that calculated personal risk. He grabbed the barrel with his left hand and turned it up and away, while his right drove into the man's solar plexus, short and very hard, the kind of impact that bypassed muscle and hit nerve. The man folded. Caleb took the weapon, cleared it by feel, and threw it toward the back of the room. A second man was halfway through the hatch. Caleb picked up the nearest solid object, a metal folding chair leaning against the wall, and threw it upward at the hatch opening. It connected with the man's descending weight and bought 3 seconds of confusion during which Caleb dragged the equipment rack below the hatch and wedged it there. The rack wouldn't hold. "Rio!" he called. 11 minutes. The front door shook in its frame. Cole fired twice through the gap. Outside, someone shouted. Victoria had moved her wheelchair behind Rio's station, which put a server rack between her and the hatch. She was watching Caleb with an expression that had no theater in it. Not fear, not awe, just the focused attention of someone tracking a situation in real time and updating their assessment. She was on a phone, the burner he'd seen her with in the car. "Who are you calling?" he said. "My extraction contact," she said. "I requested the helicopter the moment the power went out. It's 8 minutes out. We need to get to the roof." "I know." "You know what that means?" She met his eyes. "I know what it means, Caleb." He'd used his name maybe twice before now. He noticed she'd used it like it was already part of her vocabulary. Above them, the equipment rack shifted. Someone on the roof was pulling it from the hatch side. "Cole," Caleb said. Cole had heard it too. He was already moving from the door, a calculated risk, abandoning one point to address the more immediate one. And he reached the rack at the same time Caleb did. Together they drove it back up, but the rack leg had bent in the impact, and the geometry wasn't right anymore, and they both knew it wouldn't hold through a determined push. 9 minutes, Rio said. Caleb looked around the room. He was running the space. Entry points, the front door, the roof hatch, 2 windows too narrow for a body. The south wall, the one the blast had come from, had a seam where a loading bay door had been bolted shut and drywalled over at some point in the building's history. He'd noticed it when he came in and filed it without knowing why, the way he filed everything. "That wall," he said to Cole, "behind the second server rack. There's a bay door underneath the drywall. Can you get through it?" Cole looked. "Might take a minute." "You've got 2. There's a fire escape on the south side." He'd seen it from the lot. Old steel ran up the side of the building to the roof. "We go up the outside. We control the rooftop before they do." "They already have people on the roof." 2, Caleb said. "One of them is nursing bruised ribs from the chair. The second one hasn't dropped yet because the rack is still in the way. We go now." We beat them to the high ground. Cole looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he went to the wall. Caleb went to Victoria. "When we go up," he said, "you go on the evacuation chair. It clips to the fire escape rail. I'll be behind you." She looked at him without flinching. "And if we take fire on the way up?" "I'll be behind you," he said again, meaning something specific by it. She understood. Her jaw tightened once and then released. "Rio." 7 minutes. The young man did not look up from his screen. His hands were steady. Caleb was surprised by that. The rack above the hatch moved hard. They had maybe 30 seconds. Caleb found the emergency evacuation chair mounted on the wall by the utility room. Compact, folded, the type designed for stairwells but adaptable. He pulled it down and checked the release mechanism in 4 seconds and looked at Victoria. "Ready?" he said. She had already moved her wheelchair alongside him. She held his gaze and said very clearly, "Let's go." Cole punched through the drywall and found the bay door's original bolt line and kicked it open. Cold air and rain came through. The fire escape was 6 feet out and 2 feet down, and it was old and it was wet and it was absolutely the worst possible route up a building. Caleb went first to check the load rating, bounced once on the first landing, heard it hold, and came back. They moved. Above them, the equipment rack finally gave way. Below them, the front door came open. And somewhere up through the rain and the cloud ceiling and the sounds of controlled chaos rising from the street, Caleb could not yet hear a helicopter, but he'd been in enough situations to know that 8 minutes was a number that either meant something or it didn't, and right now he was choosing to believe it meant something. He climbed. Victoria's evacuation chair scraped and rattled against the rail above him. The building shook with the sound of people moving fast inside it. The rain came down cold and indiscriminate, and the iron under his hands was slick, and the night above was dark in all the ways that nights without clear outcomes were dark. He climbed, and he did not look down, and he did not calculate the odds. He'd stopped doing that somewhere around the 3rd floor. The rooftop was not empty. Caleb had known it wouldn't be. He'd factored it in, the same way you factored weather, not as a problem to be solved later, but as a condition that existed right now and had to be moved through. What he hadn't factored was Marcus. He came up over the parapet, and Marcus Hale was standing 20 feet away in a rain jacket and tactical boots, flanked by 4 men in gear, and behind them the rooftop stretched out gray and wet and bordered on 3 sides by a low concrete lip that dropped 4 stories to the street. Marcus was not holding a weapon himself, which told Caleb something about the man's self-concept. He was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of face that read well at a boardroom table, composed, authoritative, used to being the most certain person in any room. He was looking at Caleb with the particular displeasure of someone who had expected this to be finished already. Cole came up behind Caleb. Then Victoria's evacuation chair topped the parapet rail, and Caleb grabbed the frame and lifted it over the lip and set it down on the rooftop surface. Marcus looked at Victoria for a long moment. "Victoria," he said. Not angry, almost disappointed, like a parent who'd found a teenager sneaking out. "Marcus," her voice was completely flat. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know." She folded her hands in her lap. "I stopped taking your calls around the time I found the routing numbers to the Bucharest accounts." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not guilt. There was nothing in him that read as guilt, but a kind of recalibration, the face of a man deciding how much candor to use. "That's a complicated situation. 18,000 weapons units in 3 years, she said, routed through shell entities in 4 countries, sold to buyers your own analysts flagged as conflict zone suppliers." She looked at him steadily. "What part of that is complicated?" "The part," he said, "where you think you understand what you're looking at. I understand it completely. You understand a fraction of it." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. Caleb had the sense that this was a man who had learned decades ago that quiet confidence was more frightening than volume. "You understand the transactions. You don't understand the architecture, the contacts, the obligations that existed before you were running this company, Victoria, before your father was running it." A pause. "Some of what you found is not mine. Some of it predates both of us. And the people it belongs to are not people who respond well to a CEO with a flash drive and a federal contact list." Caleb watched Victoria absorb that. He watched her process it and reject it in the same motion. "That's a very elegant way," she said, "to tell me that the problem is too big for me to solve, so I should let you keep doing it. I'm telling you that you don't know what you'd be starting." "I know exactly what I'd be starting." She held his gaze. "It ends with you in a federal facility, Marcus. That's the part you should be focused on. Marcus looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody," Caleb said. "Nobody doesn't take down two of my men in an alley and walk out with a drive full of proprietary company data." Proprietary is an interesting word for weapons trafficking records. Marcus studied him. Not threatened. Assessing. The way a chess player looks at a piece that moved unexpectedly. "Seal," he said. "The posture. The eyes. The way you came over that parapet." He tilted his head slightly. "Discharged or resigned?" "Separated," Caleb said, which was the word the paperwork used and meant nothing to the man in front of him and therefore gave him nothing. "You're not a security contractor. You're not on her payroll. So you're either a very unlucky bystander or—" "Where's the drive, Marcus?" Caleb said. Marcus paused. "It's still downstairs," Caleb said, "connected to a clean system, running an upload to 3 federal contacts. You came up here personally because you thought you'd find me with it." He held Marcus's gaze. "You don't have as much time as you think you do." The smallest possible thing moved in Marcus's expression. Not panic, but the recalibration happened again, faster this time. He said something to the man on his right, low and quick, and the man stepped back and put a radio to his mouth. Caleb was already calculating. 4 armed contractors between him and any viable exit. Cole behind him with a graze wound and 6 rounds left. Victoria in the evacuation chair on a wet roof with no mobility advantage whatsoever. The fire escape they'd come up was behind the parapet, blocked now by one of Marcus's men who had moved to cover it the moment they'd crested. The helicopter was... He listened, through the rain and the distance and the sounds of people below, not here yet. What he had was a box cutter, a length of paracord still in his jacket pocket, and the certainty that none of this would move toward a good outcome if he let Marcus control the pace of it. "Cole," he said quietly. "I hear you," Cole said from behind him, equally quiet. The man on the left is favoring his right side. Ribs, probably from the chair earlier. He's going to be slow to his left, and he won't commit fully on that side. Noted. Don't go for the weapon. Go for the comm unit. If they can't coordinate with the people downstairs, the upload has a better window. That's your priority? The upload? That's the only priority, Caleb said. Marcus must have heard some of this, or at least the cadence of it, because he said, "I'd encourage you not to make this more complicated than it needs to be." He glanced at Victoria. "I don't actually want anyone hurt, least of all you. There are ways to resolve this that don't require—" "Stop," Victoria said. Marcus stopped. "Don't," she said. "Don't give me the boardroom version. I've sat across from you for 6 years. I know exactly what this sounds like when you're managing a situation." Her voice was steady in the cold air. "You tried to have me kidnapped last night. Whatever you're about to offer, I'm not interested." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with something that was almost sadness, "You always were the most stubborn person in any room." My father used to say that too. A beat. He meant it as a compliment. Something in Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at the man on his right again. Caleb moved, not toward Marcus, not toward the armed contractors. He moved laterally, fast and low, toward the rooftop's ventilation housing. A concrete block structure about 4 feet high running along the east side. And he was behind it before the nearest contractor had finished processing that he'd left his original position. Cole moved the same instant, not following Caleb but in the opposite direction, which split the contractor's attention the way it was designed to. 2 of Marcus's men tracked Caleb. 2 tracked Cole. Marcus stood still in the rain. The man tracking Caleb came around the ventilation housing fast, faster than Caleb had estimated, which told him the man was better trained than his positioning had suggested. He came around low with his weapon already up, and Caleb had less than a second to decide. He went forward into the gun rather than back away from it, the same logic as the alley. Take the angle, get inside, negate the distance advantage. His left forearm drove the barrel skyward, and the weapon discharged once, deafening, into the rain cloud above them. His right elbow came across into the man's jaw. Not a knockout. The angle wasn't right, and the footing was wrong on the wet surface, but enough to stagger him, and Caleb got the weapon out of his grip and put it behind him and kept moving. Behind him he heard Cole struggling, and then the hard, flat sound of a body hitting the rooftop, and he didn't know who'd gone down. He came up facing Marcus with 18 feet between them and two contractors remaining in position, both with weapons raised, both waiting on a word. Marcus looked at him. He was completely dry under a good rain jacket, which struck Caleb as the kind of detail that meant something about a person. He'd dressed for this, planned for this, arrived prepared for a rooftop confrontation in the rain because he'd known it was a possibility. "What exactly?" Marcus said quietly. "Do you think happens next?" "Your men don't shoot," Caleb said, "because you need me to tell you where the drive is and how far along the upload is, and I'm the only one here who knows both answers." "Victoria knows." "Victoria's not going to tell you." He looked at Marcus steadily. "And you know that." A long moment. Rain on concrete. The distant sound of Seattle traffic, 12 blocks away, indifferent. Then, from somewhere below and to the north, a sound that cut through everything. The rhythmic thud of rotors. Marcus heard it. Caleb saw him hear it. The small tensing around the eyes, the micro-adjustment of a plan encountering a variable. "That's 7 minutes early," Caleb said. "Nice." He said it to nobody in particular. He was surprised by it himself, but he didn't show that. The helicopter came in from the northeast, running lights minimal, dropping altitude fast over the Soto corridor. A mid-sized transport bird, not military, but not civilian either, the kind of aircraft that existed in the well-funded private sector. It swung a searchlight across the rooftop in one pass, and then came in for approach from the west, dropping toward the rooftop's open center, and Marcus's contractors broke their firing positions instinctively against the rotor wash and the light. That was enough. Caleb moved to Victoria. Cole was upright. He'd gone down but gotten back up, and there was blood on his face now from somewhere. But he was upright and he covered the nearest contractor while Caleb got behind Victoria's chair and pushed it forward across the wet rooftop surface toward the helicopter's landing position. Marcus shouted something that got eaten by the rotor noise. One of the contractors stepped forward and Marcus grabbed his arm and pulled him back, which Caleb filed. Marcus didn't want to open fire with the helicopter witness in the air. That was a line, apparently. Good to know where it was. The helicopter touched down hard and uneven on the rooftop surface. The pilot was good, but the surface wasn't level, and the wind off the sound was pushing east. The side door opened and a crew member in a harness leaned out. Cole got there first and climbed in. Then Caleb lifted the front of Victoria's evacuation chair up and angled it through the door, and the crew member grabbed the frame and they managed it between them in a graceless, effortful 45 seconds that felt much longer. The chair's left wheel caught the door frame. Caleb wrenched it free. The chair went in. Victoria transferred herself from the evacuation chair to the helicopter bench seat in the practiced, zero-ceremony way of someone who'd done it 100 times, without waiting to be helped and without looking at Caleb to see if he was watching. He was climbing in when Marcus's voice came through the noise, closer than it should have been. The man had walked forward. "The upload doesn't matter," Marcus shouted over the rotors. "You upload it. I'll have it contested through a dozen legal frameworks before any federal agency can act on it. Victoria knows that. The chain of custody is compromised. The facility isn't certified. Everything on that drive is inadmissible." Caleb stopped with one hand on the door frame. He turned. Marcus was standing 10 feet away in the rotor wash, his rain jacket snapping, his silver hair flattened, his face completely serious, not threatening, stating what he believed to be a fact. "I've already got 3 attorneys ready to file," Marcus said. "By the time any of this clears a federal court, I'll have restructured the accounts, relocated the principals, and wrapped every transaction in so many holding entities that your federal contacts will be chasing paper for 5 years. He looked at Caleb with something that was almost respectful. "You're good at what you do, but what you're good at doesn't help her win this." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "How's your chain of custody argument?" Caleb said, "on the 4 witnesses who watched the upload happen in real time? Rio, Diane, Cole, Victoria." He held up fingers. "And how does your legal restructuring hold up when the federal contacts she's sending to aren't just any 3 contacts, but specifically the 2 agency investigators who've been building a parallel case on your Bucharest network for 16 months without you knowing?" He paused. "She didn't tell you about them. I wouldn't expect her to." Something in Marcus's face changed. Caleb didn't know if it was true. He had no idea how many federal investigators were or weren't already looking at Marcus Hale. He'd said it because it had the specific shape of something that could be true, and because the way Marcus reacted would tell him something important. Marcus's jaw tightened in a way that was not the tightening of a man hearing a bluff. Caleb got in the helicopter. The door closed. The aircraft lifted. Through the window, in the rain, Marcus Hale stood on the rooftop and watched them go. He did not move. He did not reach for a phone. He just stood there in the dark and the wet with his arms at his sides, and something in that stillness was worse than anything he'd said. Victoria was pressing a folded cloth from the crew kit against her left thigh. She'd been shot. Caleb hadn't seen it happen, had not known until right now, and the sight of it hit him with a delayed force that he hadn't expected. The wound was below the hip, in the meat of the outer thigh, and the cloth was already saturated, and she was holding it with both hands, and her face was the particular color of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and was only now letting the body report in. "How long?" he said to the crew member, who was already crouched beside her with a proper trauma kit. "She needs hospital," the crew member said. "I know she needs hospital. How long before she does?" The crew member assessed the wound with practiced hands. Pressure and elevation, 30 minutes before it becomes critical. Maybe 40. "How far to the facility?" Victoria said, through teeth she was holding together deliberately. 12 minutes. "What facility?" the crew member said. "We're going to—" "The secondary data center?" Victoria said. Her voice was precise and clipped, each word placed carefully. "Renton, not the hospital, not yet." "Ms. Sinclair, with respect—" "Renton, 12 minutes." She looked at Caleb. "Rio." He understood immediately. "Is Rio already there?" "He should be. The protocol? If the primary facility is compromised, the secondary is the fallback. He knows to go there." She pressed harder on the wound and her breath caught once and recovered. But Marcus was right about one thing. The primary facility's upload may not be enough. If the chain of custody gets challenged, the secondary center is hardwired to 3 separate federal intake servers, government certified. If we upload from there, it's uncontestable. So we need to get to Renton, get into the secondary center, and complete the upload. "And the backup generator there is functional," she said. "Marcus doesn't know about the Renton facility. I built it separately 18 months ago, specifically because I suspected I might eventually need a location he'd never touched." She paused. "The problem is, by the time we land, we may have less than 20 minutes before Marcus's people regroup and start running location searches on my secondary assets." "You said the generator is functional." "I said it should be. It hasn't been tested under load in 8 months. Cole, holding a bandage to the cut above his eye, said from across the cabin. "So we land, we find out if the generator works, and if it doesn't, Caleb said. "I fix it." Cole looked at him. "You can fix a diesel generator under fire." "I fixed one 40 minutes ago." Cole considered this. Fair point. The helicopter banked south, and the lights of Seattle wheeled past the windows, streaking in the rain. Below, the city was indifferent and lit and going about itself without any knowledge of what was moving through its air. Caleb watched it and felt the familiar post-action inventory running through his body. The skinned knuckles, the shoulder he'd impacted on the van door frame 18 hours ago that was now making its unhappiness known in a serious way. The general bruised-all-over sensation that used to take 3 days to develop and now seemed to arrive faster. He was 37, and his body was keeping very precise records. He looked at Victoria. She was pale and focused and still pressing on the wound, and she caught him looking and said, "I'm fine." "I know," he said. "You were going to say something." "I was going to ask if Rio knows the generator situation. If it's been 8 months, he might not." She thought about it. "He knows the facility. He's been there once." She exhaled carefully. "Call him, the burner." Caleb dialed. Rio picked up on the first ring, breathless, which meant he was either running or the situation was already worse than they'd planned for. "Tell me you're at Renton," Caleb said. "I'm at Renton," Rio said. "Cole texted me the code word from the rooftop. I grabbed the drive and Diane, and we took her car. We've been here 12 minutes. A pause. And in the pause, Caleb heard something. "There's a problem." "Generator." A beat. How did you... How bad? The fuel line, Rio said. It's cracked. I don't know when it cracked. I don't know if it was sabotage or just age, but there's diesel on the floor of the utility room, and the generator won't hold pressure long enough to run. A longer pause. And I don't have parts. This isn't a hardware store situation. I don't have... What's in the building? Caleb said. What's physically present in the facility? Give me the inventory. Caleb, Rio, what's in the building? He heard the young man moving, footsteps on concrete, the sound of a door opening. Server racks, standard data center supply cabinet, cleaning closet. There's a vehicle bay. There's a company van in there. Hasn't been driven in months. I don't know if it runs. Does it have fuel? A pause. I can check. Check. Also the supply cabinet. What's in it? More footsteps, the sound of a cabinet opening. Cable ties. Mounting hardware, a box of assorted fittings. A pause that stretched. There's a length of hydraulic hose, maybe 3 feet. It's not diesel rated, it's just... What diameter? Rio measured it against something, or estimated. 3/8, maybe? The generator's fuel line would be 1/2 inch at the connection point, probably stepping down to 3/8 along the run. If the crack was in the middle section of the line, rather than at a fitting, a sleeve repair with the hydraulic hose and any available clamps could hold long enough. Not forever, long enough. The mounting hardware, Caleb said. Any hose clamps in there? A rattle of a box. Yes. Multiple sizes. Caleb did the math in his head. It was ugly math. The kind where most of the variables were unknown and the margin for error was very small. But it resolved into something that was possible. Not comfortable. Not certain. Possible. Don't touch the generator, he said. Don't try to start it. Leave the fuel shutoff closed until I get there. When do you get there? 8 minutes. He hung up and looked at Victoria, who had been listening and whose expression had shifted into something he was starting to recognize as her version of relief. Not visible as warmth, just as a very slight decrease in the tension around her eyes. The fuel line, he said. Can you fix it? Probably. What does probably mean? It means I don't know yet what I'm working with, but I know what I have to work with, and the distance between those two things is usually where the job happens. She looked at him for a moment. You talk about mechanics the same way soldiers talk about combat. It's the same discipline, he said. You assess, you adapt, you use what's available. The engine doesn't care how good you are in theory. The helicopter began its descent. Through the window, the Renton industrial corridor came into view. Flat rooftops, parking lots catching the rain, the scattered orange lights of a district that kept night shift hours. Caleb pressed his hands flat on his thighs and breathed and ran the generator problem again, more carefully this time, mapping what he knew against what he'd need and where the failure points were most likely to sit. The landing was hard. The pilot set them down in a lot behind the secondary facility, and the rotors were still winding down when Caleb had the door open. He looked back at Cole. Can you walk? Yes. Victoria? She was already transferring back to the evacuation chair, one of the crew members stabilizing it. Go, she said. Don't wait for me. Get the generator. He went. The facility was smaller than the primary, a converted warehouse unit, nondescript, with the kind of exterior that made it look like a filing company or a small logistics operation. Rio met him at the side entrance, and the young man looked like he'd been through exactly what he'd been through, which was a lot, but his eyes were clear and he had the supply cabinet box under his arm. Caleb went straight to the utility room. The generator was a different model than the primary. A Cummins diesel, newer, actually better maintained, which told him it had been someone's priority at some point. The fuel line crack was where Rio had described mid-run, a stress fracture about 4 inches long that had been weeping diesel for what looked like weeks based on the staining on the concrete floor. Not sabotage. Just a line that had been cold and wet for too long and had finally given. The hydraulic hose in the cabinet was 3/8 inside diameter, which was close enough to sleeve over the existing line if he cut the cracked section out and used the hose as a bridge between the cut ends. The hose clamps were varied. He found 2 that would work at the connection points. He needed a knife, which he had. He needed a way to clean the cut ends so the sleeves sealed without leaking, and he didn't have brake cleaner or contact cement available. But there were paper shop towels in the cleaning closet, and the cabinet had a small spray bottle of industrial surface cleaner that contained enough alcohol-based solvent to do the job imperfectly. Imperfectly was what he had. He worked with imperfectly. His hands moved fast and without hesitation, which was a different experience from thinking about moving fast. The training had always been about that gap, the space between knowing what to do and the body's willingness to do it without the mind second-guessing the details. He'd spent 6 years narrowing that gap in situations where it meant something serious, and then 3.5 years doing it with engine bays, and the two experiences had merged in him somewhere along the line into a single practice calm that kicked in when the stakes were high enough. He cut the cracked section, he cleaned the ends, he sleeved the hydraulic hose over the joint and drove the clamps home and torqued them down with a flat head from the cabinet until they wouldn't move. "Rio," he called out. Rio was at the doorway. "Yeah." "Open the fuel shutoff, slowly." Rio reached for the valve. He turned it carefully, a quarter rotation. Diesel crept into the line. Caleb watched the sleeve, watched the clamps. One of them wept a small dark bead at the edge of the screw head, and he put 2 fingers on it and held pressure, and the bead stopped. "Hold it there," he said. "Don't move the valve." He held his fingers on the clamp for 90 seconds. The bead didn't return. "Okay," he said. He sat back on his heels. "Start it." Rio reached for the generator's ignition panel. He pressed the start sequence. The generator turned over. It did not catch on the first try. It did not catch on the second. On the third attempt, the engine fired, loud and rough, and not happy about the hour or the temperature or the fuel pressure, which was lower than it wanted, but it ran. The lights in the facility came on. The server racks powered up. Somewhere in the main room, Caleb heard a sound that was either Diane or the server startup sequence, and he was too tired to determine which. He stood up. His knees were not thrilled about it. He walked out of the utility room and into the main room where Rio was already at the terminal with the drive connected, and on the screen the transfer window was open and the percentage counter was climbing. Victoria had been wheeled in from the side entrance. Her hands were in her lap and she was watching the screen with an expression of focused, private intensity that Caleb found he didn't want to interrupt. The wound on her thigh had been bandaged more thoroughly by the crew member, and she was pale but upright, and her jaw was set in the way it always was when she was refusing to let the physical world argue with her. "How long?" she asked Rio. 19 minutes, Rio said. "For all 3 federal servers?" "Yes, simultaneously. Once it's in, it's in. They can't be recalled, can't be altered. The timestamps are federally certified." He glanced at her. "It's going to work." Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. She was still watching the screen. Caleb sat down on a rolling equipment stool, the first time he'd sat since the helicopter, and looked at his hands. The skinned knuckles had dried and crusted. There was generator grease under his nails and diesel on his forearm, and his shoulder felt like something had been taken apart in there and put back in approximately the right order. He was aware, in the specific way of someone not letting themselves be too aware, that he was running low. He pulled out the burner phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he texted his sister. "Emma, okay?" 3 dots. Then, "Asleep." Took her 2 seconds. "She was asking for you." He looked at that for a while. Then he put the phone in his pocket and looked at the counter on Rio's screen. 17%. 32. 48. Marcus Hale did not come through the door. His contractors did not find the facility in the 19 minutes it took the upload to run, which meant either the Renton location had held its secrecy or Marcus was somewhere running his legal contingency plan, or both. The quiet was the kind that Caleb had learned not to trust, not because something was hidden in it, but because quiet had a habit of ending. But for now it held, and he let it hold, and he watched the counter climb. 61. 77. 89. When the screen read 100%, it showed it with nothing dramatic. Just a clean line of text, a timestamp, 3 confirmation codes corresponding to 3 federal servers, and a status field that read transfer complete. Rio let out a long breath through his nose. Diane, sitting against the wall, put her face in her hands. Victoria Sinclair looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. She didn't say anything immediately, neither did he. There wasn't a thing to say that the moment wasn't already holding. Then her phone rang, and she looked at the screen, and something in her expression changed. "Federal," she said. "It's one of the 3 contacts." She answered it. She listened. She said 4 words. "Yes, I can confirm." Then she lowered the phone. She looked at Caleb again. "They're moving on Marcus tonight," she said. Caleb nodded once. He was looking at the floor, at the diesel stain on his sleeve, at his own hands, which had fixed 2 generators and taken down 4 men and driven a truck and held a small hand in a coffee shop, and were now, finally, in the absence of anything immediate left to do, beginning their own private inventory of everything that had happened since a stranger's flash drive appeared in his jacket pocket on a wet Seattle street. "Caleb," Victoria said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. Just that. No further decoration. The same directness she used for everything. The same level, unadorned register that he'd figured out was not coldness, but was actually the opposite. It was the way she spoke when she meant it completely. He held her gaze for a moment. "The generator's going to run for about 4 hours on that fuel line," he said. "After that, the sleeve will start to give. You'll want someone to replace the line properly before then." She blinked. Then, very unexpectedly, the corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "Noted," she said. Outside, somewhere past the walls of the facility and the rain-soaked Renton night, the city moved on without knowing anything had shifted. Inside, a counter on a screen read 100%, and a diesel generator rumbled its imperfect song in the utility room, and Caleb Ward sat on a rolling stool and waited for the shaking to start, and thought about a frog drawing in a 3rd-floor window, and let himself very carefully believe that the worst of it was done. The shaking came at 2:47 in the morning. Caleb was sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway of a Renton urgent care clinic. Victoria had finally consented to medical attention after the federal confirmation call, and only after Rio had physically printed out the transfer confirmations and handed them to her like she needed to hold the paper to believe it. And he was alone in the hallway because Cole was getting his forearm properly stitched, and Diane had called her daughter and gone somewhere private to do it. And Rio had fallen asleep in a waiting room chair with his laptop open on his chest, and in the absence of anything left to manage, Caleb's hands started shaking. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, where a man's whole body gave out and he had to be caught by someone. It was just his hands. A fine, persistent tremor, left worse than right, that he couldn't stop by gripping anything because gripping just changed the shape of it. He pressed them flat on his thighs and looked at the wall and breathed and let it run its course, the way he'd learned to do years ago in the Navy when there was nobody around to perform composure for. This was the part nobody talked about, not the danger. People talked about danger endlessly, built whole mythologies around it. But this part, the hour after, when the body finally got to say its piece, and what it said was not heroic at all. Just a set of hands that couldn't quite hold still, and a chest that felt like it had been wrung out, and a mind running back over everything it hadn't had time to process in the moment, filing it in places that would make themselves known later, at inconvenient hours, for years. He'd been doing this a long time. He knew the territory. He called Emma. It was almost 3 in the morning, and he called her anyway, because he'd promised, and because promises to 7-year-olds were not the kind of thing you decided were flexible based on the hour. Nora picked up. She'd been awake, he could tell immediately, and she said nothing, just held the phone for a moment, and then there was a rustling, and Emma's voice came on, thick with sleep and immediate. "Daddy!" "Hey, Bug." His voice was level. He was good at that, had always been good at that. "Sorry it's late." "It's okay." She wasn't upset. She sounded relieved, which was worse somehow. "Are you done?" "Yeah," he said. "Pretty much." "Are you hurt?" He looked at his hands. The tremor had mostly stopped. "No." A pause. "You're lying a little bit." He closed his eyes. "I've got some bruises. Nothing serious." "Okay." She seemed to accept this. Then, "Was it the lady from the alley?" "Yeah." "Is she okay?" He thought about Victoria in the hallway of the clinic, still holding the printed transfer confirmations when the intake nurse had tried to take her back. Still straight-spined, still composed, wearing the particular expression of a person who had just set down something very heavy and wasn't yet sure what their posture was supposed to do without it. "She's going to be okay," he said. "Good." A long beat. "Daddy." "Yeah." "I'm glad you stopped." Her voice was quiet and completely serious. "In the alley." "I'm glad you stopped even though it was scary." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I'll be there tomorrow." "Promise?" "Promise." He hung up and sat in the plastic chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the particular weight of being known by a child, really known, the way Emma knew him, through years of small observations she'd never announced she was making. Kids did that. They watched you when you thought they were busy with something else, and they built a picture of you from 1,000 unguarded moments. And sometimes what they gave back to you from that picture was more honest than anything you'd ever managed to give yourself. "I'm glad you stopped." He hadn't decided to stop. That was the thing. He'd made a choice, technically, in the 4 seconds before the van door closed. But calling it a decision felt like giving himself too much credit. His feet had already been moving before his mind finished the sentence. 12 years of training expressing itself in the absence of deliberation. He'd stopped because stopping was what his body had decided, and the decision had come after, and he'd been making sense of it ever since. Maybe that was what all decisions were, finally. The body leading and the mind inventing the story of why. The important thing wasn't the story. The important thing was which way you fell when the moment pushed you. He'd fallen toward the alley. He'd do it again. Marcus Hale was arrested at 4:18 that same morning. Caleb didn't learn this until later. He was driving north out of Renton on I-405 when it happened, windows down despite the cold, the particular road noise and night air combination that he'd always needed after a bad night to help the mind decompress. He learned it from a news alert on the burner phone at a rest stop, and then he turned the phone off and drove the rest of the way in silence. The arrest had come at Marcus's home in Medina, a house on the lake that had been photographed for architectural magazines twice in the past decade. Federal agents, 4 vehicles, 4:18 a.m. Marcus had opened the door himself, which was the detail that the later reporting kept returning to, as though it meant something either way. He'd been wearing a robe. He'd said nothing. His attorney was on the phone within minutes. 7 other attorneys followed over the next 72 hours. It didn't matter. The transfer confirmations from Rio's upload carried timestamps and server certifications that were not breakable by legal strategy, and the parallel federal investigation that had indeed, as Caleb had guessed in the dark, on a rooftop, with nothing but instinct and bluff, been running for 14 months from a separate agency, had enough of its own material to render Marcus's network exposed from 3 independent directions simultaneously. You couldn't contest your way out of that geometry. The weapons network itself took longer to unwind. These things always did. The international components involved jurisdictions that moved at their own pace, and some of the more deeply buried subsidiary structures required months of forensic accounting before they resolved into anything prosecutable. But Marcus was the center, and with the center held and charged and denied bail pending trial, the network's ability to operate collapsed like a body with the spine removed. The buyers went quiet. The intermediaries scattered. The money stopped moving. It was as these things went, not a clean victory. Clean victories existed mostly in movies. What it was a sufficient one. The kind that didn't satisfy every instinct for justice, but closed the specific door that needed closing. And that would have to be enough, because enough was usually what the world offered when you got there. Caleb picked up Emma from Nora's house in Portland the next afternoon. Emma came through the front door of Nora's apartment at a run and hit him at approximately full speed, which was not gentle, and he didn't care at all. He caught her and held on, and she smelled like Nora's shampoo, and the particular small child smell underneath that which was entirely her own and which he'd known since she was 3 days old. He stood in the doorway with his 7-year-old daughter wrapped around him, and his eyes closed and said nothing, and Emma said nothing, and that was the most complete he'd felt in a long time. Nora stood in the hallway behind Emma, with her arms folded, and looked at him with the expression she'd been looking at him with since he was 19 years old. Half fury, half love, the two so braided together in her that he'd long ago stopped trying to separate them. "You look terrible," she said. Good to see you too. Your shoulder. It's fine. It is absolutely not fine. The way you're standing, it's been out of the socket, and you put it back yourself, didn't you? He had, actually, at the rest stop outside Renton, leaning against the truck. He'd done it before. It was not a pleasant experience. I saw a doctor. The urgent care in Renton counted the lacerations and told you to take ibuprofen. That's doctors. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Come inside. I made food. He stayed in Portland for 2 days. He slept 9 hours the first night, which was more than he usually managed, and woke up disoriented by the silence and the unfamiliar ceiling, and then remembered where he was and let himself lie still for another 20 minutes, which was the kind of thing he never did at home and which felt, in a complicated way, like its own small relief. Emma slept in Nora's second bedroom, and in the morning she came and found him on the couch, and they watched cartoons together in the blue pre-dawn light, Emma leaning against his side with the stuffed dog across her lap. And he didn't think about generators or rooftops or the feel of a weapon leaving someone's hands. He thought about what came next. He'd been doing that more than he expected. The shop? Harmon's would be fine without him for another few days. He texted Hector, who ran the floor in his absence, and Hector had responded with a thumbs up and a photo of a particularly complicated timing chain job he was clearly proud of. The truck needed the serpentine belt tensioner pulley re-inspected after the rushed installation. There were 3 customers whose cars had been waiting on parts since Monday and who were getting antsy. These were his problems. The deliberately small geography. The life he'd built and maintained and defended against anything that wanted to make it larger. He sat with that. He sat with it for 2 days in Portland, and at the end of the second day, with Emma drawing at Nora's kitchen table and Nora chopping something nearby, and the ordinary sounds of a household moving around him, he understood something he hadn't had the quiet to understand before. The small life wasn't wrong. He'd needed it. After Lauren died, after the months that followed her death, that he didn't talk about and didn't revisit, he had needed to get very small and very still and very focused on things he could fix. That was survival, and survival was not something to be ashamed of. He'd kept Emma fed and housed and loved, and enrolled in school with a teacher who knew her name, and those were not small things, regardless of the word small. But he'd also, somewhere in the maintaining of it, started treating the smallness as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. He'd started patrolling its borders against anything that might require him to be more than a mechanic and a father. He'd started calling that discipline when some of it was actually fear, not of violence, which he'd never feared the way other people did, but of consequence, of becoming necessary to something again, of being the kind of person whose presence or absence actually changed an outcome. He'd been that person for 12 years in the Navy, and it had cost him in ways he was still accounting for. So he'd retired the version of himself that cost things. But cost wasn't the same as wrong, and the alley had reminded him of that. The alley and the rooftop and a generator in Renton running on a hydraulic hose sleeve and 2 inadequate clamps had reminded him that the skills he carried weren't a burden he was managing. They were him. And you couldn't build a real life by leaving most of yourself out of it. He drove back to Seattle on the 3rd day. He'd been home 4 days when Victoria's assistant called. He was under a Subaru Outback at the time, doing a rear differential service, the kind of job he found genuinely satisfying, which he recognized as a specific personality trait and had made peace with. And he had to slide out and wipe his hands and call back, which he did from the parking lot with the noon sky pale gray above him and the sound of traffic on Eastlake running underneath everything. The assistant was professional and brief. Miss Sinclair would like to meet at his convenience. No urgency, no pressure. At his convenience was said twice, in a way that communicated it was meant, not just said. He met her the following morning. Not at the Sinclair Aerospace Building, which was currently operating under a board-appointed oversight committee while the internal damage from Marcus's operation was assessed and addressed. She chose a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, small, wood-paneled, the kind of place that had been there since before the neighborhood changed and had survived by being good enough at the thing it actually did. She was at a corner table when he arrived, wheelchair positioned with her back to the wall, in the way he'd noticed she always arranged herself in public spaces. a habit of someone who'd spent years reading rooms for accessibility and had stopped thinking about it consciously. She looked better than she had in Renton. The wound on her thigh had apparently been cleaned and properly dressed, and she'd managed sleep, or at least her version of it. The butterfly tape on her cheek had been replaced with a smaller adhesive strip. She had coffee already and a second cup across from her that turned out to be black, which was how he drank it, which meant she'd asked or guessed or noticed. He sat down. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "Functional?" "That's the mechanic's version of fine." "They're the same thing." He picked up the coffee. "How's the leg?" "Functional," she said, with the slight deliberateness of someone returning a serve. He almost smiled, not quite. She looked at him directly, the way she always did. He'd come to understand it wasn't intensity for its own sake. It was just how she gave people her attention, completely, as though divided attention was a form of disrespect she'd decided not to practice. "Marcus's preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. The federal attorneys are confident. The chain of custody on the Renton upload is airtight, and the parallel investigation material gives them multiple independent grounds." She paused. "His attorneys are arguing duress on the weapons transactions, that his participation was coerced by entities above him in the network. Is that true?" She thought about it. Partially, there were relationships that predated him. He didn't build it from nothing. She looked at her coffee cup. But he maintained it. He expanded it. He made choices at every point that kept it running and growing, and he made those choices because they were profitable and because he believed he could control it. She looked back up. "Duress is what you claim when you want credit for having had no good options. Marcus had options. He just didn't like them." Caleb thought about that. About the particular human capacity for deciding that the situation excused you, that the constraints you operated under were unique, that your compromises were forced rather than chosen, that responsibility belonged to the architecture and not the person who decided to live inside it. He'd seen it in the Navy, and he'd seen it in corporate news coverage, and he'd seen it in private, in his own quiet moments, when he'd wanted to blame the smallness of his life on grief and circumstance rather than on the choice to keep it small. "There's something I want to ask you," Victoria said. "The job." She paused. "You knew." "The outline's been visible since the parking lot in Renton." He set down the cup. "Director of Executive Security, restructured, properly funded, built from people you've personally vetted." "Yes." She didn't dress it up. "The board is in agreement that the security apparatus needs to be completely rebuilt from the ground up, with someone at the top who has no prior relationship to any of the compromised infrastructure. Someone I trust." She held his gaze. "Someone who has demonstrated, under conditions that were not theoretical, that their judgment under pressure is worth trusting." "I'm a mechanic." "You're a former SEAL who also happens to be an excellent mechanic." A pause. "The mechanic part, frankly, is what made the difference in Renton. Anyone can be trained to fight. Not everyone can fix a diesel generator with a hydraulic hose and 2 wrong-sized clamps while someone is shooting through the walls." She said it without inflection, just as a fact she'd filed and kept. "What I need isn't a fighter. I have people for that. What I need is someone with the specific combination of tactical judgment, calm under pressure, and the ability to improvise within broken systems, and the integrity to tell me the truth about what I'm facing when everyone else would rather manage my anxiety." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not a small job," he said. "No, it isn't. Emma's in school here. She's got a teacher she likes and a friend named Zoe, who she's been best friends with since kindergarten, and Mrs. Garza downstairs who watches her when I have late jobs." He looked at Victoria. "I'm not picking up and relocating. Seattle is where the headquarters is. We're not discussing relocation." She met his eyes. "I'm also not discussing 70-hour weeks. The previous structure was badly designed. Everything ran through one person who had no accountability. I want a different model, a real team, real hours, real life outside the building." She paused. "I've been running this company since I was 26 years old, and I've missed a significant number of things that I didn't intend to miss because I built the infrastructure wrong and never fixed it. I'd prefer not to replicate that mistake in the rebuild." He studied her face, the particular quality of honesty in it, not performed, not angled toward persuasion, just the thing she actually believed, said plainly. "You said something on the rooftop," he said. To Marcus. About your father. She didn't flinch. He used to run the company. He built most of what Marcus eventually corrupted. What happened to him? A beat. He died. 6 years ago. About a year before I took over. She looked at the table. He was a difficult person. Brilliant and difficult in the way that a lot of people from his generation of business thought were the same thing. She looked back up. I spent most of my 20s trying to prove to him that I was capable of running what he'd built. He spent most of my 20s making sure the standard was high enough that I couldn't be certain I had. A pause that held something in it she didn't fully open. He wasn't wrong about the standard. He was wrong about the method. Caleb thought about his own father, who'd been a different kind of difficult. A man who communicated love primarily through expectation and whose approval Caleb had chased into the military and eventually stopped needing somewhere over a decade in, though the chasing left marks that had taken a long time to fade. He thought about the ways parents shaped the architecture of you without meaning to, and how much of your adult life was the project of figuring out which parts of that architecture were yours and which parts you'd inherited and couldn't use. He thought about Emma and the stillness he'd given her, and what he owed her besides safety. I want to talk to Emma first, he said. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Of course. Not to ask permission, she's 7, but to explain it in a way that's honest. She's been through something, and she deserves to know what her life is going to look like going forward, not just be told. He paused. She asks good questions. I want to be ready for them. Victoria's expression shifted in the way it did when something surprised her. Small, quick, mostly contained. That's more than most people do. She's observant, he said. She notices things I don't tell her. The least I can do is tell her the things I can. He drove home after, through the rain. The rain had returned, as it always did in Seattle, without announcement or apology, just as a fact of the air. He stopped at the grocery store on Eastlake because they needed the good cereal, and also because standing in the middle of a grocery store at midday was about as different from the past week as a person could get, and the difference was something he needed to feel. He picked Emma up at 3:15. She came down the school steps in her frog boots, which she'd apparently worn 4 of the last 5 days because she was committed to them in a way that delighted him. She had a painting rolled up under her arm. She handed it to him when she reached the truck. He unrolled it. It was a painting of 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing in what appeared to be a rain, with yellow umbrellas, except the small figure also had frog boots clearly rendered in careful green paint, and around both figures she'd painted a border of small geometric shapes in gold and blue. Art class, she said. It's us. He looked at it for a long time. It's really good, Bug, he said. I know, she said simply, and got in the truck. He told her that evening, after dinner, pasta, the simple kind, because some nights that was what there was, sitting at the kitchen table with her drawings spread around them, and the rain against the windows doing its constant thing. He explained it the way he'd decided to explain it. Not sanitized, not dramatic, just honest in the proportions a 7-year-old could use. That the woman from the alley ran a big company. That someone inside the company had been doing something wrong, and the woman had needed help to stop it. That Caleb had helped. That the wrong thing was stopped now. That the woman had offered him a job. Emma listened through all of this with her chin in her hands, which was how she listened when she was taking something seriously. A job like at the shop? She asked. Different. I'd be in charge of making sure the company and the people in it were safe, kind of like security. Like a guard? More like the person in charge of all the guards, planning things, making sure the right people are in the right places. He searched for an analogy. You know how in the videos you watch about how things are built, there's always one person who has the whole plan in their head and they're making sure every part fits together? Emma considered this seriously. The engineer. Sort of like that, but for safety. She turned her juice cup slowly on the table. This was another thing she did when she was thinking. Small, deliberate rotations, like the motion helped the thought. Would you still fix cars? He hadn't fully worked this out yet. On my own time, maybe. Not as my job. Do you want to? He looked at her. Yeah, he said, I do. I think it's the right thing to do. Even though it's going to be harder? He thought about that, about the life he'd kept small, and what it had cost him to keep it, and what it might cost him to let it grow. Yeah, he said, even though. Emma nodded. She went back to rotating her juice cup. Then she said, Is the lady in the wheelchair going to be your boss? Technically. Is she nice? He thought about Victoria Sinclair in an alley in the rain, assessing him. In the back of an SUV, giving him the truth without managing his reaction to it. On a rooftop in the dark, saying, let's go with a bullet wound in her leg. She's fair, he said. She's honest. She's harder on herself than she is on other people. Emma seemed to file this. That's usually a good sign, she said. He looked at her. That's what you always say, she said. About people at the shop. He had said that. He'd forgotten he'd said it enough times for her to carry it. Yeah, he said. That's usually a good sign. He called Victoria the next morning and said yes. She said, good. And then there was a brief pause and she said, I'll have the formal offer sent over this afternoon. If anything in it doesn't work, tell me directly. Don't let the HR people negotiate you. Okay. And Caleb? Yeah. Emma. How did she take it? He was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the alley below. The dumpster, the fire escape of the building across the way, the ordinary gray morning. She asked if you were going to be a good boss, he said. A pause. What did you tell her? I told her you were fair and honest and harder on yourself than other people. Another pause. Longer. That's a generous summary. She came to her own conclusion, he said. She said that's usually a good sign. He heard something on the other end of the line that he hadn't heard before. A small, brief, genuine sound. Not a laugh exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that suggested Victoria Sinclair, somewhere in a Capitol Hill morning, had been caught off guard by a 7-year-old's verdict and didn't know what to do with that except feel it. I'll try to live up to it, she said. That's all any of us are doing, he said. He hung up and finished his coffee and looked out the window and thought about the frog drawing. It had been in Emma's bedroom window for 6 months, faded, slightly peeling at one corner, blocking the morning light in the specific way that had made him think about taking it down and replacing it with something newer. He'd never done it. He'd never done it because taking it down would have required having a reason, and the only reason would have been that it was in the way, and a drawing Emma had made and put in a window wasn't in the way of anything that mattered. It was still there. He could see it from where he was standing if he leaned slightly to the right. Some things you kept because they mattered. Some things you changed because staying the same was its own kind of loss. The trick that nobody taught you, that you had to work out slowly through the specific losses and decisions of your particular life, was knowing which was which, and even then, you got it wrong sometimes. You kept the wrong things and let go of the right ones, and then you spent years correcting the accounting. Caleb Ward had spent 4 years keeping the grief and letting the rest of himself get quiet. He'd done it to survive, and it had worked, in the way that most survival strategies worked. Adequately, at a cost, for a limited time before the costs outran the adequacy. He had a daughter who painted them both in the rain with gold and blue borders around the edges. He had a truck that ran now, with a correctly installed tensioner pulley. He had a job that would ask more of him than he'd allowed himself to be asked in 4 years, by a woman who was going to tell him the truth about what she needed and expect the same in return. He had a mission. Not the kind he'd had at 23, with a team and a target and a government behind him. Not the uncomplicated clarity of a military objective, where the right thing and the assigned thing were usually the same thing. This one was messier and slower and full of the specific civilian complexity of organizations and trust and accountability to people who didn't answer to any rank structure. But it was real. And it was his. And it had been given to him, indirectly, by a woman in an alley and a 7-year-old in frog boots who had stood with her hands on a brick wall and not been scared. He rinsed his coffee cup and got his jacket and went downstairs to the truck. He had a differential service to finish, and after that a timing chain that Hector had started and wanted a second opinion on, and then a conversation with his landlord about the month he'd like to give notice, because the building on Eastlake had served its purpose, and there was a neighborhood slightly to the north with better school district boundaries that he'd been thinking about since Emma mentioned her friend Zoe was moving there. Small things and large things, running alongside each other the way they always did, because life didn't stage itself for clarity. It just kept moving, and you kept moving inside it. And if you were paying attention and a little bit lucky and willing to stop on a wet street when your feet decided to, sometimes you found that the movement was taking you somewhere worth going. The truck started on the first try. He pulled out of the lot and onto Eastlake, and the rain came down the way it always did, indifferent and steady and already forgiven. And Caleb Ward drove through it toward whatever the day had, with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and for the first time in a long time, no particular wish to be somewhere smaller.